agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm Trey and Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined by Ken Katkin, a professor of law at Chase Law School. But before we get into the show, I want to let everyone listening know that people are constantly asking us, asking Mike, asking me, asking all the guys, where are the video episodes? Even among my students, the first question when they find out that I have a podcast is always this: where do I get to see your all's faces? Where's the video? Is it on YouTube? Why can't I watch it on YouTube? But I'm going to be honest. The reason is clear. I'm a full-time professor. I generally teach overloads, lots of overloads. I do other things for campuses. And so audio production in and of itself is already a major task. And adding video means significantly more work for myself and for Mike. And now Mike has already said this, but I'm going to add to it. And we're going to be saying this every show for July. And that is, we here at the Politics Guys, we've got a promise for you. If over the next month, 25 people either become new supporters or increase their level of support where it is right now, we'll start releasing some video episodes. Plus, everyone who either becomes a new supporter or increases their support in this month will also be entered into a drawing to get a year free of membership at whatever support level you're currently at. You're absolutely right. So you basically are getting a raffle ticket by either becoming a new supporter, or if you are, we're not leaving you out, if you're already an existing supporter, if you just up your level of support, you get to be part of that raffle as well. And there's more. That's right. Not only will we get 25 new or increased supporters, does that mean we're going to start releasing some video episodes? Not only will you then get the ability to be part of that raffle, you're also, for the rest of the month of July, going to get a special discount. You can either get 90% off your first month for monthly supporters. Now, heads up, we make it free. Patreon doesn't allow us to do that. So the next best thing is 90%. You're going to get either 90% off your first month or an additional 10% off for yearly supporters. That's a lot of money. So not only do you get all those other benefits, but if you do it right here, you're also going to get that 10% off for yearly supporters or 90% off if you're on the month-to-month basis. Now, remember, again, you're getting a better deal if you're a yearly supporter anyway. Now, to take advantage of those deals, you're going to need to use a promo code. For the nearly free first month, it's 943D. And for that additional 10% off annual support, it's 9B50C. Now, good news, this is not the military. You don't have to remember those numbers. They're going to be down there in the show notes. So those promo codes, I'll have them there for you in the show notes right next to the links to get and become a member of the show. Now, so if you want both a discount and a future where there are video episodes of the Politics Guys, head to the show notes right now for those discount codes. Become a supporter or increase your support today and make it possible for us to take the time to add to the busy schedule. So I have already heard from Mike that we've had a few people do this. I don't know what the number is right this second, Ken, but you know, any moment now we could be hitting 25. So be the 25th person. That should be something else, right? If you're the 25th person, I don't know. I shouldn't say things I can't make, but we're getting in. So Ken, I'm going to come back to you. I've been ignoring you for a second, friend. But I guess my first question for you, Ken, is how comfortable are you releasing your identity and your face to the world like this? Like, how do you?
Well, you know, I sometimes like to say I've got a face for radio, but the I guess the viewers will decide.
Well, and see, they're going to get to understand or what to think about like what we're showing. So I'm always recording from my office generally. And you know, we could do funny things about this. I'm generally recording from my office at school. I'm doing it right now, even though it's the middle of summer, I come in. I just live around the corner from campus. I come in. So you're seeing like kind of my professional view. I'm not even going to say what's in Ken's background, because if you want to see what's in Ken's background, you've got that'll be part of the fun. What's in the background? I actually think Justin would probably have the funniest background. And I'm not going to say why. I'm just going to leave it right there and say that he'd have the funniest background. But so let's get into some stories, Ken. Let's get into the things that we need to talk about. So let's start with Iran. Now, I'm going to be honest with listeners on a moment, and I know, I'm sure you feel this way too. In a better world, we wouldn't be talking about this still. I am kind of tired of talking about Iran. I won't lie, but we need to. We're going to start the show with this because we saw this week the end of the ceasefire and maybe the beginning of another ceasefire between the United States and Iran. And to be clear, it was already a relatively soft meaning to the word ceasefire to begin with. But the Memorandum for Understanding was officially dead, and the United States, however you want to think about this, and there's some interesting legal principles here, is back in what you might call a hot war. The Trump administration had decided to revoke the Iranian oil exports waivers this week, which was one of the few things that was apparently, according to reporting, keeping Tehran at the table. Iran swiftly went to its go-to move, economic pain. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard launched coordinated strikes against commercial tankers navigating the Strait of Hormuz, including a Saudi vessel and one from Qatar. The hits, obviously, are deep violations of international law, so much so that even Qatar, which has traditionally been a peace broker with Iran, argued that Iran is going to have to bear the full financial consequences of their aggression. Then, hours later, while still at the NATO summit, that's a story that we're going to get to in a minute, President Trump authorized attacks on 80 targets inside of Iran, including some critical ports. After that, Iran targeted 85 separate American and allied installations across the region. At the same time, Iran held a multi-city funeral procession for Khamenei, where millions of mourners are openly calling for the assassination of the American president, which actually kind of plays into a potential plane story that we were talking about before the show, Ken, and argue that Iran, effectively that Iran is going to maybe come after him. So whatever might have been left of that reform or opposition movement that existed not too long ago, it appears to be effectively dead. Now, at the same time, this morning, there were additional developments. And one of the primary bits of this is that in addition to authorized and Pentagon agreed to attacks, so after the mission was declared over overnight, there had been an additional attack. And so the question becomes who dropped the additional bomb. The Pentagon denies. It's already released its list of 90 targets, but it made no mention of Bashur, which is the location that's been hit here. And Iran is claiming that it is potentially the UAE. And in response to that, they have hit back at four countries, Jordan, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain, escalating things further today. One of the things that I saw that we talked about again a little bit before the show started was Israel is neither confirming, denying these attacks, but neither are these other partners. So that remains kind of the late breaking news on this, Ken. So, again, I keep asking you, we've talked about the broad question of what's going on in Iran, but I will start there in a sense to say we've got weird things domestically when it comes to the power of the president to continue to engage in these attacks based on the law. And at the same time, we have what's going to happen just internationally de facto, regardless of what the legal status is.
Right. I mean, yeah. So there's so much to talk about there, but
very much. I'm sorry. I'm just like, here's all it is. Right. Take it away.
Right. So I think the sort of top line question is, is this war going to end? And Trump has announced many times that it's about to end or that it has ended. There is this memorandum of understanding that.
But you got to be careful. I am curious. I'm glad you went there first because there almost seems to be this perfect cadence. The markets and the weekly cycle and his announcements, they couldn't be any more perfectly correlated if I was trying to create a data set for freshman students for understanding how a regression worked.
Yeah. And of course, it's the oil barrel prices too. So it seems like, even though there's never been any truth to it when he says the war is over, nonetheless, anytime he says the war is over, the price of a barrel of oil drops, and then that's what makes the markets go up. So that's but then it always proves out within a day or two that actually there's still fighting going on, and then the price of oil goes back up again, and then the markets go back down again. And that, it's hard for me to really understand why the markets keep believing anything Trump says, but it seems like they usually do believe it for a day or two and then not. And although it's also true, I have to concede that the price of oil has, even though it keeps bouncing up and down when he talks, the general trajectory has been down since earlier in the war.
Well, and
so,
there's a famous apropos. It's true. I mean, there is truth to it, though. In the short term, markets are betting machines. In the long term, markets are weighing machines, and so people are trying to make those quick dollars on the short ranges. But you're right; it makes things look a little irrational when you zoom deeply into those moments.
Yeah, that they're Trump says we've got a ceasefire. The Straits of Hormuz are opening. There's not going to be more bombing, and even though he's already said that 20 some odd times and it never holds true, every time he says it, it seems to impact the markets. And so I Michael and I talked about this last month. I know, I don't remember why, but I know you missed the show last month, and I did it with Michael, although I know you did it with some different weeks. But when we talked about this. I predicted that the war can't really end while Trump is still in office, and I'll stand by that prediction because he really can't accept any kind of victory that doesn't, completely have the optics of being a victory. To the extent that it's a negotiated settlement and that Iran gets some of their objectives, and people can say, Trump got nothing out of this whole war. We're no better off than if we'd never started the war. Ultimately, Trump's not going to be able to abide by that, but he's also not going to get anything better than that. So I don't see a real way. I think the dynamic we've been seeing for a month, I see that going on for another 18 months. I don't know. I don't know if you see that any differently.
Well, it is different because this is actually one of the issues, I think, among the hosts that we've got some of the most disagreement about, right? I did a show. I mean, it's been a month ago. We did a 3-person show. And on that one, Mike, for example, thought I was being far too negative about the positive outcomes of the conflict as it related to bringing things together in other effectively Arab countries, reducing the support for the Strait of the Hormuz. He thought I was being pretty negative about that. Justin is probably a little bit closer to you, but kind of falls in the middle. This is one. It's funny to me. I think this is another example of where the two of us we disagree. Like, we have some severe ideological disagreements, but on a lot of like the pragmatic day-to-day policy things, we tend to be pretty close. And I was a little shocked by that because I thought, here I am. I'm the one going, this is a disaster, friends.
Yeah.
I mean, again, I can see that there are. I don't want to suggest. I'm not gonna disagree. Yes, having there be problems in OPEC and them coming around and increasing production, woohoo! I'm going to take wins where I can get them. But I guess I'm not as convinced that those are things. I don't think they can be, as you were pointing, they're not going to be perceived as wins because of the conflict, because they're more like incidental, right? It's kind of like saying, I crashed my car and I got this beautiful new car over here. Well, yeah, but that was just the sideline.
Right.
I still crashed the car. I still got hurt. I still had to go to the hospital. There was all these issues, right? And so I'm with you. I'm not even sure what a future president would do.
Well, I think
extricate us from the conflict. I'm not sure.
I think that could be done. I mean, let's say we get someone who's very much of the same viewpoints as President Obama. I think at that point, it would be very possible to get back into something like the Obama JCPOA, where we get the Iranians to allow inspectors to make sure they're not working on nuclear weapons, but that they are allowed to, enhance uranium for civil uses of nuclear power, and that they would let, UN type inspectors go in as they did before, and that they wouldn't be agreeing to any kind of regime change. They wouldn't be agreeing to, reduce their own military, but they would just be agreeing to allow inspectors to make sure they're not working on nuclear weaponry. I think
one
we
of
could
the
get to that
new
point.
sticking points has been, as you look at the details,
Yeah.
Iran has not been willing to give up the idea that they're now going to control tolling on the Strait of Hormuz. And now, again, that's a violation of international law. You can't do that.
Yeah.
But they have demonstrated that they can effectively keep it from going through. I mean, this is one of the things, Justin and I got in some deep weeds about kind of the military side of this. There does not appear to currently be an effective military strategy to stop these kinds of small boats from keeping the strait closed. And so I guess that's the piece there. So I hear what you're saying.
Well,
could you have an Obama that kind of ideology go back? But would Iran be willing,
yeah, they would.
What are they getting to opening up the strait? I think they're going to want something more than the past.
Yeah, they're going to open up the strait, but they are going to get something more. They're going to first of all get a lot of sanctions lifted against them, and they're going to second of all get their frozen assets in the United States released to them. And so that's what they would get in lieu of tariffing the straits. And so I think a future president, will be able to do all that. But I think it's just impossible for Trump to do all that. And I don't think the Iranians are going to settle for much less than that.
I hear that. And maybe you're right. I mean, we're powerful. We're going to strong arm other countries into things. But it seems like especially the UAE might have some issues with lifting some of those in the light of them taking the damages that they have.
Yeah, well, I mean,
in other words, that peace process assumes that the other Arab partners who traditionally were not closer to the United States and now are closer to the United States are willing to make that exchange after having suffered the amount of damage they've suffered from Iran.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is another thing that would have to be addressed, but it could be, I think just brainstorming here, spitballing, like one way I could see that would make that work. And again, it would involve a different president, not Trump, would be that you figure, well, the U.S. started the war against Iran. So the U.S. would owe Iran some reparations for that. And Iran bombed these other Arab countries, and Iran would owe those countries reparations for that. And there's all this Iranian assets that have been frozen here the whole time. And so maybe the way you pay for that is you say, well, we'll unfreeze some of these Iranian assets and we'll return them in part to Iran and in part to these other countries that, Iran should rightfully owe reparations to, but that they won't have to cough it up out of their own money now. It'll be coughed up out of the unfrozen assets of theirs that are already in the United States.
Now, I agree. There could be some spitballing you could do around the frozen assets.
Yeah.
But if you had anything that looked like the word reparations or non-held money that was going to Iran from the United States, you might as well kiss a second term goodbye. Nobody would be okay.
No, sure they would. I mean, Obama did that and he was okay and he got reelected. He released a lot of the frozen assets.
He released pre-existing Iranian funds. What I'm suggesting is you would use a different word in addition to that, which would suggest that we would give additional taxpayer funds.
No, I wasn't saying that. I was saying
then we're on the same page. That's fair. That's fair. I'm there if it's if it's giving away Iranian funds that have been held. I thought you were going a step further and saying there could be some kind of additional reparations package.
It's a reparations package, but it's not out of American taxpayer funds. It's out of a combination of releasing frozen Iranian assets and lifting sanctions that Iran's been under for a long time.
Then on that front, I agree. That would not be as politically costly. I agree. Okay. Yeah.
So I think there's plenty of solutions here, but the thing is, the solutions end up putting the U.S., slightly behind where we were before Trump started this war.
At best case scenario, it puts us back to the deal we had
3
deals or 4 deals ago now under Obama.
But with even more sanctions lifted and even more assets unfrozen, and with a great diminishment in U.S. prestige around the world. So I think it does leave us worse off than if he'd never started the war. Everyone will perceive it that way. But I think, that's why it's impossible for him to do, but it would be possible for his successor to do, because the successor will just blame all that on him, for starting this stupid war in the first place that the public was always against.
So the other piece here then, and again, we'll probably deal with this again when it relates to McConnell as well, but it does appear there's going to need to be additional releases of money to make some of this continue to happen. Just on the money side, from my point of view, it seems like even Republicans are not willing to pony up the kind of billions of dollars. I mean, the last time I looked at it was somewhere in the vicinity of, I believe, 90 change billion dollars is what's going to be asked for here. It seems like that's going to be a bigger ask.
Yeah.
What do you mean? My point of view is I think there were going to be restrictions on that. I mean, so another possibility is the war ends as a result of the actions or the inactions of Congress. What do you think about that?
Well, I don't think that can end it that fast because, Trump is, I think the number he just asked for is $87.6 billion. And, that is probably going to be pretty hard to get out of Congress and, maybe even impossible to get out of Congress if McConnell's seat stays vacant because his vote would be needed in committee to even bring it to the floor. But remember, the annual appropriation was over $1 trillion to the Defense Department, which is about a 30% increase over where it was in the final Biden year in office. So it's not the Pentagon's not broke yet. It's I think the idea of Trump's supplemental was to maintain otherwise the levels of defense funding that he wanted, and then getting extra money to pay for the Iran war. But if he doesn't get the extra money to pay for the Iran war, then I do think he could just spend down this extremely large budget that was already appropriated, and it would take quite a while longer before the Pentagon actually ran out of money. So I think it would certainly, put a little bit of a ratchet against Trump that, if he keeps this up, at some point he's going to run out of money. But I don't think it would immediately make it impossible for him to continue the war.
And we ought to be careful. I mean, this is the same administration that has argued that every time there's not a bomb dropped, another new clock resets for
right
hostilities to try to bypass actions of Congress. So, yeah, I mean, that's an excellent point. Other thoughts about Iran before we move on to NATO, Ken?
Well, we could speculate a little bit on who might have dropped these bombs today. I think you named the possibilities, but it's interesting to think about all the different, reasoning, I suppose. Like, I think Israel certainly does have an incentive to try to keep this war going, that it's, Israel's interests and the U.S.'s interests are fairly different from each other, because I think Trump was mainly in this just to project his own power or American power. The U.S. isn't really at much danger of, Iran, attacking our homeland militarily and trying to, do anything really terrible here. Israel, I think, figures that they face existential threats every day that the Iranian regime stays in, and that the Iranian military has capabilities. So I think that they would feel that it's important to either get regime change in Iran or to decimate the Iranian military to the point that it has much less capacity than it has now. So I think they do have a lot of incentive to try to keep this war going and not see it end. And then it's interesting about the perspectives of the Gulf Arab states, particularly Saudi Arabia, and that those countries were participating in that bombing and that they were also bombing Iran. And, earlier reporting suggests that although there was a lot more publicity in the United States about the role that Netanyahu played in convincing Trump to even launch this war, that, part of the picture was that Sheikh Mohammed of Saudi Arabia was similarly whispering in Trump's ear, trying to get him to start this war. And I think some of those Gulf Arab states are, very uncomfortable with the role that Iran has played in their neighborhood. So there's a lot of possible suspects out there for who's trying to keep the bombing going. And I think also in almost any of those cases, no matter which one it is, it actually illustrates further difficulties in getting to a ceasefire. The U.S. and Iran, they can't actually have a ceasefire if other countries are going to keep dropping bombs.
It's true, and part of the reason that makes it hard, and I think sometimes the reporting in the United States is so American centric that it sometimes throws off those kinds of considerations. But Iran, in response to the United States actions, effectively just lashed out at everything around them, even relatively close partners, right? Like I had mentioned earlier, Qatar has always been a spokesperson and kind of a bridge for Iran, and they're striking them. It's a terrible sets of moves. I mean, but anyway, but you're right. As a result, then it's kind of like the bully is, we knew that we were going to hit him, right? But there's so many people who are aggrieved with him. We're not sure who was the one who, threw this particular punch. And is yet another reason, I think, as I had mentioned earlier, I think it's more complicated than Americans realize, because Iran, take Trump out of the equation, there were already fissions between Iran and its neighbors. And this has just escalated that to the nth degree.
Yeah, and also I think the strikes were not, the Iranian strikes against Arab states were not random, because they struck the countries that have U.S. bases there, and I think that for most of the past,
but they weren't striking U.S. bases. In the randomness is what I'm saying is they were just hitting any soft target that they could get to.
Yeah, that's true.
And so that's a good point. That was vague.
Yeah.
You're going to have a very different response. Had they been striking or attempting to strike what you might call hard or American targets in those countries, I think it would have been different than what you saw. Like, so for example, just the kind of the constant civilian airstrike warnings going on as buildings were getting hit inside of, say, like the UAE. That's going to have a different kind of response from the country. I just will.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think they did try to strike both, but maybe just had more success at striking the civilian targets. But I think they did also try to strike the American bases, but with less success. But I think the big point there is that the reason there are American bases in all those countries is because those countries believed that it made them safer to have those American bases there than if they didn't have those American bases there. And I think that Iran is very consciously trying to, reverse that way of thinking about it, that if other countries are getting struck because they have American bases there and America isn't actually able, to really bring this war to a conclusion, then, they're actually less safe for having the American bases there. And so I
think on that one, Iran miscalculated. It appears relatively clear to this point that it has made, even in a bad war situation, it has made other Arab countries more likely to want to work with the United States. At least to this point, that seems to be empirically what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, right. Well, they're not going to make immediate changes in the middle of the war, but I think we'll have to wait and watch what happens in terms of how much the U.S. bases remain welcome in the Gulf states, again over the next decade or so.
That's fair. But as we think out, to that next decade, let's think a little bit about the other big story, which was the NATO conference in Turkey. So putting the Iran story behind us for just a moment, let's head to Turkey, where the annual NATO summit just concluded here on Friday with a traditional show, not with a traditional show of Western unity, but rather with kind of really, in some ways, a structural damage. President Trump stood at the microphone on Wednesday and single-handedly ordered a total and immediate halt to all United States trade and official visits with, wait for it, Spain. Yeah, Spain. Yeah, you were thinking Russia, but no. He quite literally turns to his Treasury Secretary and says in front of the entire global press corps, tells him, look, cut Spain off entirely. Look, quote, watch them come running back, end quote. So why, you might ask? This is strange. Well, the White House argues this is due to a punitive measure over NATO's internal defense spending targets. As Politics Guys listeners might remember, NATO set pretty aggressive new benchmarks requiring every member state to spend 5% of their GDP on defense by 2035. Spain is the lowest, and it currently sits at 1.5%, which is what led them to be called hopeless and terrible by the president. Spain, admittedly, has been dragging its feet on spending targets. Other NATO allies have upped that more rapidly than Spain has. Now, linking that with our first story, there's also the possibility that this is retaliation over Spain's prime minister's positioning himself as effectively an anti-war voice. The prime minister has openly accused the United States of driving the global economy into a ditch of inflation and violence. And more importantly, Madrid did something the White House considers pretty unforgivable. They revoked U.S. military access to vital joint development bases on Spanish soil and completely locked down their sovereign airspace, forcing American transport planes and fighter jets to taking a pretty circuitous routes to reach the Middle Eastern theater. And so I want to start with that. There were other things, including the plane and Greenland, but let's start with Spain first. We'll try to kind of hit these one at a time. It might be difficult for listeners to realize it's really strange to come out on the stage, blindside your ally with those kinds of comments. What's your takeaway? Do you think this is related to the anti-war portion, or do you think it's more related, as the White House suggests, to its slow defense spending?
No, I think it's the former, that he's been, because the Spain prime minister maintained a public posture of opposition to the U.S. invasion of Iran. And as you said, didn't allow the U.S. to use joint bases in Spain, which are, relatively close to Iran compared to most of Europe, and also didn't even allow the planes to go through Iranian airspace. I think that's what this was all about. It's hard for me to really imagine that, Spain's failure to spend a little bit of money on its own defense really, was the proximate cause here. But to me, the bigger takeaway is not what Spain did or what Trump said, but just how completely irrelevant Trump's words were treated by everybody there, right? That nobody believed that there was any chance that could possibly happen. And of course, there's no chance that could possibly happen. And so Trump's sort of transitioning NATO and Europe, to a kind of status quo or kind of new normal where, the things the U.S. president says are just totally ignored.
Yeah, and I think it's important for listeners to understand the extent to which it can't happen, right? One of the things to recognize is Spain is a member of the European Union, and the European Union now does its trade policy in block, right? And so as a result, you can't effectively block Spain without blocking other European Union nations.
Yeah.
So his comments, in some ways, I would put them at kind of almost the level of a freshman who doesn't really understand and saying, hey, we ought to get at Spain. And you have to kind of pull him to your office and say, just heads up.
Yeah,
it doesn't work that way.
Right, right. I mean, nobody even felt the need to even say anything about what he said. Like, it was just ignored with eye rolls. And in fact, the final, at the end of the whole summit, as always happens at the end of the NATO summit, there's a declaration that the NATO members all sign about what they agreed to, and the U.S. did sign it. And Trump could have maybe refused to sign it, but he didn't do that. And all of the things that are in the declaration, which is July 8th, they're all the European priorities, including continuing to defend Ukraine, which is something that, Trump has not really wanted to do, but he signed it, along with anyone else. There's nothing in there whatsoever about any role for NATO in Iran, where he's actually spent a lot of his rhetoric saying
you're
that
right, but let's be clear. There's an obvious reason why.
Yeah,
Trump's signature is about as important as the things that he reads, right? Yeah. The likelihood that he cared what was in this hovers so obviously to zero that it doesn't matter. I mean, you could have had a clause in there that said that his soul was perpetually, belonged to Ken Katkin. And I think he still would have signed it because, as you rightfully noted a second ago, no one takes what he's doing seriously.
Yeah.
And nor should anyone think that he's going to be bound by any either comment or signature. Seems to be so clear of him that it's and yet we keep reading the things as if it. You hear him saying, like, I don't disagree, but you get what I'm getting at here.
Yeah. No, I think that's right, but I still think it's noteworthy that even though I completely agree with you that his verbal statements and his written signature are, equally non-trustworthy, but I still think that, when he bloviates about what he's going to do to Spain, that's not that his bloviations don't have any legal status, right? When he signs the Ankara Summit Declaration, that's also signed by all the other NATO members, that's an international agreement. Now, maybe he wouldn't honor it, but it
right.
has,
Because again,
yeah.
think recently, I'm not trying to hammer at Trump. I know many of his opponent or his supporters, suggest this is one of his advantages.
Yeah.
But did we have we abided by international law when it came to boats? Has it?
No, I'm not disagreeing with you.
Oh, okay.
I'm not saying that he is actually going to do anything. I'm going to read from what he signed, right? So he signed that he was agreeing with all the other NATO countries that, one of the top things that they've just agreed upon this week is that they're going to work together to counter the long-term threat Russia poses to Euro-Atlantic security and stability. Now, I don't think that he's going to do anything to counter the long-term threat that Russia poses to Euro-Atlantic security and stability. I'm completely agreeing with you that he's not actually going to comply with what he just signed. But I think that, the fact that he signed it and all these other countries signed it, that is something that really indicates that nobody cared what he said. Maybe nobody cared. I think they would have cared if he didn't sign it. So I would say that. Suppose Trump had actually said, no, I like Russia. I don't care about Euro-Atlantic security and stability, so I'm not going to sign this. I think that would have been much more significant, than if he just went ahead and signed it and said that, NATO is going to basically keep doing what it's always done. And, whatever I said about Spain over here, that doesn't have to be written down. And however much I want NATO to get involved in Iran, that doesn't have to be, I think it's just still, he's committing to the status quo in writing, and he's not getting any of the changes that he's asking for in writing. And
sorry,
okay.
Finish. I thought you'd finish. I
just think that has political significance in terms of Europe basically being, okay, he can bloviate, but it all means nothing. And, we've come out of this summit with NATO, including the United States, reaffirming of all the normal things that NATO stands for.
Now, of course, he had one more blovation that we'll mention again. It's been one that's gone back. He decided to blovate on Greenland, right? In this exact same press conference that we're just talking about, where he's torching Madrid. He looks at the Danish delegation and he brings forward again his long dormant, highly controversial demand that the United States purchase Greenland from the Kingdom of Denmark. And back in his first term, this was kind of laughed off. And I think part of what you're suggesting here is that that's the take that everyone needs to take.
Yeah.
I am a little less sanguine. If I was a European, if I was on the staff for, European power for Denmark, on the one hand, you can't react to everything that President Trump does. I get that. I agree with you, right? He's going to continue to sign his signature but he is willing to act in unpredictable ways. And oftentimes when he keeps kind of ruminating, bloviating on an item, there comes a point where he does something. What do you think about that here? Right? Because again, I can't help the Spain thing. It's new. That seems more on what you call the blovate side. The Greenland feels a little bit more to me as that trial balloon. He just keeps floating over and over and over and over again until he does something. What do you think?
No, I don't think he can ever do anything on Greenland. In fact, one of the things he just signed, which I think is a reference to Greenland, although the word Greenland doesn't appear in it, but the number one first paragraph in the Ankara Summit Declaration says, "We, the heads of state and government of NATO, reaffirm our ironclad commitment to our collective defense. An attack on one is an attack on all." Right? So, he signed that too. Right? So every NATO country just signed something this week that says an attack on one is an attack on all. So if he is going to attack Greenland, then he is going to be attacking all members of NATO. And he's going to be implicating not just the original NATO treaty, but, even the most recent Ankara Summit Declaration. and requiring all the other NATO countries to come defend. And, and they have been running some military exercises over there because they're taking them seriously, or maybe because they just think if they run the military exercises over there, then the U.S. will be less likely to actually invade because they'll see that other countries are going to participate in the defense. But that I think he's lost all trust with NATO, but that he's not going to start a military war against all of our NATO allies at once, and that's what that would involve.
So our kind of the last thought about this before we move forward to some domestic politics, Ken, is we did have a little bit of the jet controversy, and we talked about that before the show was even going live this morning. President Trump effectively gets a questionably legal present bribe. I don't know. We'll let that be a little ambiguous. And then the United States spends a significant amount of money trying to get it ready to be Air Force One. There was a funny little controversy. It's not really worthy of a lot of a conversation, but apparently, like, all the books in the rooms, Leavitt was in one of the rooms and taking like picture on this plane, and the books are actually all fake books. Like, even the titles are fake titles, which I thought was funny. Usually they take real books and cut them in half, so they don't take as much space. But anyway, be that as it may. But the more real part of this story was, President Trump doesn't end up taking this, in part because, as I had noted at the outset of the story, this is taking place in Turkey, which for those of our geographically challenged friends might not realize. I don't mean that in a teasy way. If you haven't looked at a map, that borders Iran, right? There's a significant border between Turkey and Iran. And as a result, the Trump ends up taking the original Air Force One instead of when we call it Air Force One Plus. It needs its own name. I teasy. I don't know. But you had some thoughts about that I thought were at least a little bit telling about that.
This is all just really stuff that was reported out in the New York Times yesterday, and also on MS Now. But, apparently the story as it was reported is that, when Trump, received, I guess he received this airplane from Qatar that was, had fancy leather seats and had the U.S. flag painted in accurate colors on the inside, and all kinds of things like that he thought just made it much more tripped out than the old Air Force One, and he wanted to fly around in it. And then he spent hundreds of millions of dollars of U.S. taxpayer money to upgrade it so that it could be used as Air Force One. But apparently when he was just now flying to Turkey, the Secret Service prevailed upon him that those upgrades were just not good enough to make the plane secure if he was flying that close to Iran, that Iran would certainly be trying to assassinate him. He, after all, just assassinated their leader and a lot of their other top government officials. And he's flying into their neighborhood in a plane that actually, didn't have adequate stealth radar, didn't have adequate hardening, didn't have abilities to do things like refuel while in midair, or to make certain maneuvers in midair that are difficult, evasive maneuvers. And that also didn't have the proper secure communications channels, so that if he needed to have like a situation room while he was in the air, that he could communicate securely with the ground. And so it lacked all these features, and he was prevailed upon and ultimately did agree to fly the old Air Force One, which is a much better plane for all those purposes, despite all the money that he'd spent, upgrading this Qatari plane. And then I think when he was asked about that by the media, like, why did you fly in the old Air Force One rather than in the one you got from Qatar that you seem to like so much, he said, it was he wanted to fly in the new one, but that so many soldiers stationed in the Middle East had been asking to see the new plane because it was just so cool that he let it fly ahead without him, so that all the soldiers would have time to look at it, which they otherwise wouldn't have time for. So that was sort of his story, fairly ridiculous story.
Who doesn't want to take a visit through the new Air Force One when you're a pilot?
Yeah. So I mean, it just sort of adds to the ridiculousness of him, and I would say accepting a bribe from another country and being so dazzled by like bells and whistles that this thing had, that he's not even thinking about the basic functions of what Air Force One is supposed to be for. So that was sort of all I thought about that.
Well, then on that, why don't we move forward to our Platner story? So we'll close by heading up to Maine, and I'm sorry, Ken. Usually we're dealing with Republican Party disasters, right? Like that's Right now, we get to talk about a Democratic Party disaster, which is more fun for me, maybe. I don't know. Yeah. So the campaign of progressive Grahm Platner didn't just hit a speed bump, man. It got driven off the cliff. Platner, he's a 41-year-old decorated Marine Corps veteran, a disabled advocate. He's an oyster farmer, as he likes to make sure everybody knows from his first video even. And he's also, importantly, deeply progressive and has really been embraced by the far left of the Democratic Party. And he ran a very aggressive anti-establishment campaign, and that has been a winning position for Democrats so far in this primary cycle, which often, again, for listeners, be aware, that's how primaries generally go. And he initially focused on moderate Maine Governor Janet Mills, so much so that he forced her to resign from the race back in April. Now, he is on the June primary by a 72% win. That's huge. So what's going on? Well, if you've been living under a rock, what happened was this. A former girlfriend came forward with some pretty harrowing, detailed accounts of Platner's, raping her, a prolonged domestic abuse, and some really highly disturbing physical intimidation. Now, if it had just been that would have been problematic in and of itself. But that report became problematic as a result of already pre-existing red flags that I would posit the campaign had been desperately trying to suppress, including the controversial chest tattoo, which looks pretty much like a Nazi tattoo that was used by the SS. A long history of sharing anti-Semitic posts on social media, not to mention that his post that he attempted to take down as it related to women. So the Maine Democratic Party, the National Progressive PACs, and pretty much every elected Democrat who had stood with him have now rescinded their endorsements and frozen his campaign bank accounts. And again, not small people are with him. I mean, he was backed in big ways by Bernie Sanders and by Elizabeth Warren, and this is going to be a stain on them, as this is. Now, here's where the technical stuff comes into play. So we got to talk about that. We also have the technical stuff. So under Maine law, Platner, he can't just simply be replaced because the party doesn't like him anymore. He has until 5 p.m. today to formally submit his withdrawal of his paperwork. And he, in his video, he has this really intense video that he released recently. He's suspending his campaign, but he's not going to back all the way out. He's not going to sign the papers unless he gets to have a part in deciding who his replacement may be. And that's going to be happening sooner. We disagreed before the show got started. I was going to say, I think this effectively gives Susan Collins a pretty easy seat. Others have disagreed. So I'm curious, what do you think happens now? And what are your feelings about this? I think it's a pretty big stain on a couple of big Democrats, especially in their era, rightfully, of getting after Trump. But then they have long now backed their own kind of Trump figure, and it's going to cost them.
Well, yeah, first, just for the clarification for the listeners, you said 5 o'clock today. That's Friday. So the listeners may not hear this until after
that. Is fair. That is Friday. 5 o'clock. So on Friday.
We're recording on Friday. So I think by the time the listeners hear this, they'll actually know whether Platner withdrew by 5 o'clock on Friday or not. We don't know that yet. I just checked again right now. It's 1:17 p.m. on Friday as we record, and he has not withdrawn yet. So yeah, the issue there, the thing is that Platner got 72% of the primary vote. It was an enormous blowout, and I think that he, does think that however much he might agree that he's turned into a flawed candidate who can't win, and that he ought to withdraw for that reason. He seems to also, assert in that 11-minute video that you mentioned that these allegations are false, right? So he is asserting that. He's not in any way agreeing that there's any validity to the allegations. He's only agreeing that they would prevent him from being able to win the election, no matter whether they're true or false, and so he should withdraw. But he's taking the position that since he got 72% of the vote, and since he denies the allegations and he's only withdrawing for the good of the Democrats and to help them win the seat, that he should have a role in choosing his successor and making sure that the successor comes from the same wing of the party that he came from. Now, there's almost no support for that idea among any of the power players in the Maine Democratic Party. I think not only do they think that, if he's already tarnished by the allegations, which most of them, I think, and probably most Democrats in the country now, as of today, are inclined to agree that the allegations are probably true, even though he's still denying them. And so he's tarnished by them, that if he helped pick the next candidate, that candidate would be similarly tarnished by the association with him. But then it's also the case that, he was running an insurgent campaign against the Maine Democratic Party establishment. So the Maine Democratic Party establishment seems less likely, to want to choose someone from his wing of the party, than from the wing of the party that most of them are part of. And I'm sure they also believe in good faith that someone like as far left as him would have a harder time winning a general election. Although I would say I don't agree with that. I think that someone as far left as him would have an easier time winning a general election than someone more to the center, and that the evidence for that is just how big he won the primary. So,
but you got to be careful.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
The empirical data has long been true. You move to the extremes in a primary, and you move in general towards your median voter in the general election. Now, it is true that in the last couple of cycles that there appears to be a potentiality that doesn't hold as true anymore, because you can win with kind of very deeply passionate bases who can turn out at the right amount. But I would, as a scientist, I would be careful about postulating that given the few data points that we have yet. So could that be a shift that's underway? I'm absolutely open to that possibility. So I hear what you're suggesting. But but if you said, Trey, you got to put $1 million on something, I'm going to use the theory that's been demonstrated over and over again before I put the $1 million right on a couple of data points. But I hear what you're saying on that front. But I think there's reasonablement to suggesting that his primary numbers do not guarantee that he's gonna knock out Susan Collins, especially when you account for incumbent advantage.
Well, and again, now we're not talking about Platner, right? We're talking about Platner's replacement, because of course I agree with you. Platner could only lose the election if he ran. He's got no chance of winning an election.
Yeah. Fair. Yeah. I took us off into the weed there. Apologies.
To the successor. Yeah. Someone with his, well, the thing I would say though about Maine is a state where Collins, is popular, and she's always overperformed, and she could do it again. So I'm not going to rule that out. But Maine is also a state that, like the rest of New England, has been moving slowly but surely more and more blue. So I think that the concept that you need to appeal to the center includes as an assumption there that you need to appeal to non-aligned voters, to independent voters, that winning all the votes in your own party isn't enough to win. And I'm sure that assumption is false in Maine now. That in Maine, if they just get all the Democrats to vote for the candidate, they can win. They don't need any independent or Republican voters. They just need to unify the Democrats. And so if the question is, who can unify the Democrats better, I got to believe that if Platner, and remember with Platner, a lot of his flaws were known, when people, not to the extent that.
No, and that's another thing we need to talk about. You're absolutely right. But
the Nazi tattoo stuff had already come out. The allegations from some women, not necessarily of forcible rape, which came out this week, but of some kinds of lesser abuse.
Even if you put the comments aside, the things that he wrote that we can read.
Yeah, all that was out there, and he still got 72% of the votes. So that's what I'm reading as saying that the 72% of the vote was because the overwhelming center of gravity of where Maine Democrats are now is progressive, not centrist. And I do think Democrats alone can carry the election if they stay unified.
But here's my little additional take, and this is for Maine, but it's a broader comment as well. I think progressive needs to be really careful here. One of the reasons I believe that we're seeing that progressive move in the party is that progressives have been because they're the most anti-establishment, they have been willing to be the most anti-Trump. I would caution the party to think that the progressiveness will continue beyond Trump. I think part of what pushes them there is not the particular positions, but it's the actual, in other words, they're willing to overlook, let's be specific, you're willing to overlook Platner because he's willing to be such a fighter. He's going to go after Trump. And it would be, I think it's easy. And I think what a lot of analysts have missed is said, oh, here it is, man. Democratic socialists are taking over. It's Bernie Sanders 2.0. And the answer is, yeah, there's a little bit of that happening. I'm not denying that there isn't some of that churn happening there. But if you drill into that 72, I'm going to say it's because it's willing to go toe to toe with Trump, and people are willing to deal with some pretty nastiness that you shouldn't. All right. I would say that no one should have dealt with Platner to start with, just based on the things he wrote. Put aside the comment, put aside the allegations, because again, they could be. Let's just take him at his absolute word. I don't think we ought to, but let's just do that. He's 100% free of that. The things that he wrote were sketch, absolute. But why are you willing to deal with that? Because the person who writes sketch things, there's some new research that suggests that one of the things that people like in those kind of online mediums, foul language, angry language, because that means you're being real, and you need a real person to take on on President Trump. That's my read. That's my read.
There's a lot of that I agree with, and I'm only going to slightly disagree in some small emphases. So first, the parts of what you just said that I agree with completely and fully endorse would be that within the Democrats right now, the issue of, progressive versus centrist is less important to voters than the issue of who's going to fight Trump the hardest. And it's not automatically the progressives that are going to fight Trump the hardest, but it could be, to give some examples of people I wouldn't put in the progressive camp, but who fight Trump pretty hard. Think of, someone like Congressman Jamie Raskin or Senator Adam Schiff, right? These are not people that are in the Sanders wing of the party, but these are people that fight Trump very hard. And I think that is what the voters want more than anything. And so I agree with you. I think what I understood you to say is that progressives are a little bit more likely, just in terms of just the facts of who happen to be the progressive candidates, to be able to present themselves as people who fight Trump really hard. But that, if a progressive isn't going to fight Trump really hard, or if a centrist, even a Gavin Newsom, who's trying to, position himself as someone who would fight Trump really hard, and nobody's going to call Gavin Newsom a progressive, the issue of who's going to be a fighter is the number one biggest issue, and that the left center stuff is less important. I agree. If that's what I understood you to say, that I 100% agree with that.
Okay, so far we're on agreement. I got you. So now, where's the tweak? I think
the tweak is that economic issues are becoming important for a lot of voters. Economic issues are ostensibly what got Trump elected in 2024. Although I'm not totally sure I believe that, but that's the conventional wisdom. People do seem concerned about Trump's policies that are, causing inflation, whether it's the tariffs or the war, or that are just, not helping people with affordability. I think it's not a good look for Trump that he's not signing the housing bill, although I guess today it will become law anyhow by operation of law, because it's been on his desk for 10 days. But clearly the Republicans who passed that bipartisan housing bill,
they thought it was.
Yeah.
Although that was a story we could have taken on, because Congress is not in session right now.
No, they're in pro forma session.
Right. But there's already been a case dealing with that when it came to appointments.
Yeah.
And so it is not clear to me. Again, I think this is something I don't think anybody's touched. As you might recall, during the Obama administration, they argued that pro forma does not count for being in session, and therefore, which means that it's very likely that a Supreme Court could argue that it's actually it's not a automatic pass, but an automatic veto.
The court held the opposite in Noel Canning. It held that a pro forma session is a session, and they are in session for that purpose.
They did. Wait, I had that backwards then. I will bow back on that front. My apologies.
Yeah, that case was called Noel Canning, and you're right. It was about appointments, but it did say that pro forma session is a session.
Count. Well, then I will.
Yeah. So that's why Obama lost the case. He argued that a pro forma session was a recess. I said it backwards. He lost the case. So of course I think he probably lost the case because he was Obama, and he would have won the case if he was Trump. But that's the rule right now. So Yeah, it's gonna become a law today, and certainly the Johnson and Thune both said that as well. But I think they think they need to be seen as doing something for affordability, and so I think to the extent that people perceive affordability to be a very important issue, and to the extent that people also perceive kind of it's weird with unemployment, but the unemployment numbers are not that bad, but they seem to be very skewed so that people who have jobs are not being subject to that many layoffs, but people who don't have jobs and are trying to get into the job market are finding it, very difficult, especially college grads. And, I think that, those issues are issues. And I do think the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is speaking to people with those concerns, to Democrats with those concerns, more than the centrist wing of the Democratic Party. So I think there is for some, I think Trump remains the number one issue. And I agree with you that on the Trump issue, for Democrats, it's just who's going to be a fighter that really matters more than whether they're progressive or centrist. But I do think a secondary issue is affordability and, economics generally. And I think the progressives are having more success speaking to Democrats on those issues right now than the centrists are.
Well, friend, I'm gonna pause myself there because we've already gone over.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, it will be. So again, by the time listeners you're hearing this, it is very likely, unless you listen to the show as soon as I drop it, that we'll already have some of the answer.
Actually, before we leave this issue, I know you want to end, but can I just take one more thing? Yeah. So I think I wanted to credit you with Nate Kahn, who's the statistician who writes for the Times about these things. He completely agreed with you. So I want to point that out, that, he said that because of all these problems that Platner just caused, and on the assumption that Platner will resign by 5:00 today and won't be the candidate, Kahn calculated that this whole episode has increased the chances that the Democrats will win Maine, not decreased it. And he's calculated that that's specifically because of the thing that you said, which is that the candidate is going to wind up being closer to the center, and a candidate who's closer to the center and who presumably won't be tarnished by scandals is just going to have a better chance in the general election. So he thought that it wasn't just the scandals, but also the far left progressiveness that were actually, weights that were holding Platner down a little bit, and that liberated from that.
But now, where I disagree with his analysis, since we're going to coda on it, is though the data is clear that the biggest issue for getting elected in the face of a long-standing incumbent is name recognition. And as a result, no matter what happens, if we're going to have another candidate, they're going to have effectively 30 seconds of real time to run a campaign. So you're going to be fighting a huge amount of incumbent advantage. As a matter of fact, just for like a stat that always blows my students away, I mean, for all of modern history, the incumbent wins at over a 90% rate, right? So for all of contemporary elective history. So when you look at the current Congress, being the incumbent is the single biggest predictor of where you're going to win or not. Now, there's things that can knock you off. Obviously, it's not 100%, but I think sometimes when you're listening or people are thinking about this and we talk about incumbent advantages, they're thinking of like, oh, it increases you 50 or 60 or something. No. And that's where I think it's going to be difficult for the new person, because they're not going to have a lot of time to have their name be known. And that is the kind of the grassroots empirical difficulty that they're going to face. So in terms of his analysis towards the middle, he and I agree. In terms of what's going to ultimately win, I think that Susan Collins wins.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that I know you want to end this, but I have to repeat what I said before. This is going to be a referendum on Trump, and Collins has name recognition and Trump has name recognition.
Well, but she also has voted against Trump.
Yeah, but the question again, because Maine is a more Democratic electorate than it was 6 years ago, it only really matters if the Democrats are against Trump or against Collins enough. If they don't know anything about the Democrat at all, the Democrats are going to vote for the Democrat.
Well, I would suggest that the evidence is contrary to that fact. It would suggest, ironically, that even if you are a Democrat or Republican, if you're in a state, you will find your own. It's as a matter of fact, when you study Congress, it's the weird. Congress is terrible, right? So Congress has long had terrible polling data, but when you talk to people about their own congressperson, they always outpoll the institution itself, right? It's the other people who make it bad. So again, I hear what you're saying, but I think we're going to end. I like it. We're going to end on a disagreement here. Yeah. I hear what you're saying, but no, I think that it is the incumbent advantage extends to the opposite party. And the name recognition will as well. So you're not wrong that, of course, if you're a Democrat, you're more likely to vote for a Democrat, but not at a guaranteed rate.
Yeah. Well, it's good that we could end on a disagreement. So that,
yeah. We agreed deeply on Iran against all the other guys, right? Yeah. So on this one, we can disagree. It's great. I still think maybe at some point we need to do. We've talked about this, like doing a bigger show, like kind of a battle royale, where it would be fun to see where we all kind of end up gravitating, right? Ken is kind of, or Ken. I was trying to say, Mike is in this whole, he's moved further to the center in his opinion, right? He thinks he's more conservative now. He abandoned the Democratic Party. So it'd be like, but where does he actually pragmatically end up, agreeing with that? I think it could be fun, but
right. Yeah.
I will pause us there. And I will say though, just as a reminder, don't forget down in the show notes, you're going to have the codes for either your nearly free first month or for your 10% off on annual support. So make sure to use those codes, and you're going to want to do it this time, because don't forget, for the rest of July, if we get 25 or more new supporters or supporter increases, then we're going to start releasing some video episodes. And I'm excited about that. I'll be honest, Ken, I would love to do this as my full-time job. That's not going to, I don't know. Maybe there's somebody out there right now who's like, I got $1 million. Here's the deal. I would take a couple of years off and just work on the show. That'd be fun. But until that happens, don't forget to head down to the show notes and become a supporter today. You get all kinds of benefits. But again, right now, the big ones are going to be, don't forget that nearly free first month and those at 10% annual front and the ability to have video episodes. But of course, you get things like Discord too, which is a lot of fun as well. If you don't want to head to the show notes, you can also get all of this too at politicsguys.com/support. And then, of course, if you want to reach out and say hi to us, you can always email us at mail@politicsguys. If you're not positioned to get that and you want to get those midweek episodes, Ken and I are going to be taking on the Federalist Papers, which is, listen, this has been so much fun. You can also always mail at politicsguys.com us so that we can hook you up with that as well. But don't forget, now is the time. Lock that yearly subscription in so you can get the rest of the Federalist Papers, because something tells me we are not going to get it done in a year. So come on, join now and you can get the rest of that as well. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. That always helps us. So does sharing episodes, including this one. And I finish, as always, to the people who just do a ton every month for the Politics Guys, and they are our executive producers. Thank you so much, gentlemen and ladies. You are Wilmer Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, Jody Marie Miller, and Sean Fugit. We'll be back with a midweek supporters exclusive episode on Tuesday and a full episode next weekend. I hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,